let's move over to Bangladesh. This is an area, I believe it's known for higher quantities. Like if somebody has a volume program, this is a good place to go. Tell me why.
Being in Bangladesh and looking at the size of the factories, there are large production lines on multiple floors, and being in both Dhaka and Chittagong, you see a huge amount of consistency with the factory size. And almost every conversation when I'm in Bangladesh about production is, can you fill a line? Can we keep lines consistently running?
Welcome to Clothing Culture, a fashion industry podcast at the intersection of technology and innovation. I'm Emily Lane.
And I'm Bret Schnitker. We speak with experts and disruptors who are moving the industry forward and discuss solutions to real industry challenges.
Clothing Culture is produced by Stars Design Group, a global design and production house with more than 30 years of experience. Welcome back to another episode of Clothing Culture. We are here once again, going through a table talk conversation. This is where we talk about newsworthy topics, as well as address questions from the audience. Today, we're going to be talking about production, understanding origins for production, minimums, strengths, and weaknesses. This is something that we are addressing daily in conversation, so we thought this would be rather timely. We've had a few longer episodes about this topic, and today we're going to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of those specifics. You can also, by the way, find this nifty little download that will support a little further knowledge. So, with that, let's roll. Bret, when we're talking about key countries that are known for production in apparel, one of the first that comes to mind is China.
Why would that be?
Well, I believe it's still the largest producer.
Yeah, for sure.
Tell me a little bit about what has made China such a powerhouse.
Their commitment to production and industry globally. I mean, they're a powerhouse for not just our category, but pretty much everything that the U.S. and Europe and every other country purchases today. I mean, it's been an intentional goal for that country for a long time. So,
are there certain products in apparel that are a key strength?
China overall, for many years, have really concentrated on diversifying and making sure that all products, all categories are strengths within the country. And that goes all the way down to footwear, accessories, everything. You really can get whatever category you want out of China. I think as labor rates rise in the country, certain categories become more and more challenging. And then certainly with some of the restrictions on cotton in the country, as we've talked in other episodes today, those categories are taking a little bit of a hit for sure. But China is really good at producing all categories, all fabrications, from basic commodity items to very, very complex. There's factories that are doing very, very unique things in the industry.
What are MOQs like for this country?
The interesting thing is that when you have a country that has so much production, and you've got certainly outrageously large, medium, small, very small, kind of cottage industry within the country. All of those things exist in these large producing countries. So you can get production, in the hundreds of thousands of units, millions of units production, all the way down to, in women's wear in China, there's certain small shops that are maybe making 100 or 200 pieces, et cetera. That's not to say that it's super affordable, not to say that it's not super efficient, but there's a place for it. When you're looking at production for an overall industry, there's things that we look into requiring certifications. Are they treating their workers fairly? Is there certifications to make sure that those are happening? Health, safety, all of those areas. It's more challenging to manage those certifications when you have a very, very small factory, because those certifications are time-consuming and expensive. Right. So most of those really occur in medium, large to large facilities. And within those facilities, the minimums become a little bit more important, because when you're setting up a line, it can take maybe half a day to prepare the line for production. It can take maybe half a day to tear it down. And so for some of these smaller quantities, we call them MOQs, minimum order quantities, the efficiency is kind of divided across all of the setup, tear down.
Sure.
Right? And so on natural fibers, usually the MOQs run somewhere around 1,000. People will maybe do less than that, 750, 500, but you get premium surcharges, and no one likes to do those really.
Right.
In these size factories. And then for synthetics, they're usually about 1,200 units per style per color. Unless you jump into nylons, and nylons, the fabric itself dictates the minimums.
So it's higher, right?
It is higher. Acid dyeing requires higher minimums, and so usually somewhere around, depending on the consumption of the garment,
right?
Because of the fabric, it can be somewhere around 3,000 units per color, per style.
So as the world is seeking to broaden their manufacturing portfolio, one of the countries that we love and are focused on is India.
Sure.
Can you tell me why this has become such a key area of interest?
Well, one, much like some of the other countries in the Near East, they've really focused on apparel as a major sector. Now, even India, like China, has tried to move past apparel as being a main area for the economy. All economies go through this shift from kind of textiles and apparel into appliances and other
technology.
things, and then they get into technology. And India's no exception. That's happening too. But India itself is this. We're united, at least in the U.S., by a common language. So there's not a big language barrier. They are aligned kind of with the U.S. in terms of mentality and thinking, and a democratic kind of environment.
A creative spirit as well.
Yeah, very creative, entrepreneurial. I say the Indians can be very entrepreneurial. You give them a difficult task, and they want to figure it out. And that's not indicative of all cultures, especially in the apparel industry. And India also, based upon how they've structured their industry, they can do the same. They can do, again, you're looking at these certified factories, those minimums are about the same. But India is mainly a cotton producing nation.
Okay.
As on our recent trip, we were in India for about a month, we're seeing some massive shifts from a government focus to provide both incentives for building more synthetic production plants, but also timelines tied to those incentives. And in India, that's a really important thing. You tie a timeline to an incentive, then things can move very, very quickly. In India, some things don't move super quickly.
So from a product strength standpoint, knowing that it's very cotton rich, I would imagine it's also apparel programs that are, use the cotton fabrics. So
of course.
Tees, sweatshirts.
Yeah, a lot of knitwear fabrics and natural fiber. There's a growing bottoms kind of industry. For a lot of years when I was in India, it was just very difficult to get a reasonably priced bottom, and now we're seeing more and more of that come online. Certainly woven shirts, and they've kind of, in terms of the world looking at woven shirts, plaid shirts, yarn dyed shirts, India is really a main producer in that category also.
Let's move over to Bangladesh. This is an area, I believe it's known for higher quantities. Like if somebody has a volume program, this is a good place to go. Tell me why.
Being in Bangladesh and looking at the size of the factories, there are large production lines on multiple floors, and being in both Dhaka and Chittagong, you see a huge amount of consistency with the factory size. And almost every conversation when I'm in Bangladesh about production is, can you fill a line? Can we keep lines consistently running? So they're really focused on large production, basic production. They don't do a lot of very, very complicated finishes, not a bunch of complicated assembly work. There are some outerwear factories in Chittagong that do some nice outerwear pieces, but it's still very large minimums. 8,000 units of a style, before they really want to sit and talk to you in outerwear. And then in the factories that are doing sportswear, they really want 20, 30, 40,000 unit conversations. They can be made up of maybe multiple colors with different prints, but they, if it's doing a t-shirt or something like that, but they still want 20 or 30,000 units just to begin the conversation. There are people that will talk to you about doing less quantities, but I think doing the research on what those factories look like, what's their long-term expectations, you can get some short-term gains if you can get into a factory to do some smaller quantities, but it's not really a long-term conversation in Bangladesh.
We've had a lot of questions about Pakistan recently.
Yeah.
What's happening in that country?
So in Pakistan, they've definitely focused on apparel as a major, economic category. And when I look globally in terms of segmenting programs into different areas, you really get incredible value in things like fleece and sweatshirts there. They produce a good 2-thread and 3-thread fleece. You got, again, to concentrate on the individual factory and production unit, but the cost-value relationship for heavier weight cotton fabrics is certainly seen in Pakistan versus India, for sure.
Okay.
They struggle with all of the unique finishes as a country overall. They're more driven by more commodity items, but there's certainly gems there that are doing some interesting finishes and better quality.
I remember when COVID happened, a lot of the world moved from China to Vietnam, and then very quickly those factories got, very full with demand. It seems like that demand has not really left Vietnam. Why? Tell me about the strengths in Vietnam.
Vietnam is less expensive labor than China, which is a big plus. They also have good productivity similar to China, not exactly to the same level, but the workers move very quickly. European companies have focused on Vietnam, especially French companies, for a long time. Used to be kind of a French protectorate. And so they've had an established garment making and assembly operation for years. The downside to Vietnam is that there hasn't been an entire ecosystem from fabric manufacture. So the majority of fabrics that come into the country are coming from China. So China is producing the fabrics, you're bringing those in. So whenever you're transporting fabrics into the country, you tend to have to deal with larger minimums because the transportation, the clearance through customs, the inland delivery, those are not inexpensive items. If you're trying to do that on small quantities, it's not super effective.
Are you still paying a duty on part of that garment because of the fabric being imported from China?
Sometimes different countries, depending on the fabrications, will levy certain amounts of duty. Vietnam has a import charge per container, but they're not necessarily, from my knowledge, doing a duty because they're reliant today on fabric from other countries. They are building more of a developing kind of position in more factories or textile mills in the country, but they've got a long way to go.
Okay. In North America, there's been a lot of requests for nearshoring. And in that, Central America has been a region of focus. Are there some key strengths or weaknesses in this particular region?
Certainly duty-free is a big strength on any fabrication that is manufactured in the Central American country area.
Okay.
And so they have some restrictions to qualify for duty-free, but there is certainly large mills there that are producing fabrications for duty-free. Surprisingly enough, with our time in El Salvador, there's a big emphasis on synthetic in El Salvador, which I think shows a great benefit to the U.S. because duty rates on synthetics for most countries outside of China are 32%, means about a third of the actual cost of the garment is paid to the U.S. government for importation taxes.
Right.
In China, now that you have the 7% tariff, it's almost 40% of the cost of the garment for synthetics.
How do they compare with regards to labor rates and overall production time?
Productivity is lower and labor rates are higher.
Okay.
So the offset a little bit for that duty free is that you're paying more for those garments in general. On mass scale basics, T-shirts, printed logo tees and things like that in Guatemala, they're churning out quite a bit and their productivity is good, but those are simpler garments again.
Yes.
So understanding what a country does well and doesn't do well. You don't want to walk down into Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador and start doing very, very complicated items, because that's just not the country for that.
And we've seen a pretty diverse range in that region for, quantity minimum.
Sure, you've got small máquinas
Yeah.
that will do small quantities, but they're generally not certified. They don't have a lot of QC control. You kind of see what you get with those things. Yeah. And then the factories that are medium to large, and some of them that are very large there, you have a completely different deal. You have got to reserve lines.
Yeah.
They're fully booked, and if you can't go in and do a hit and run. You can't do a program and then leave and then expect to get back in again.
It's really a long-term relationship.
It really is.
Yeah. Okay, so the final country that I want to talk about today is bringing it home to the United States. We've talked about the fact that the United States mostly abdicated apparel manufacturing many years ago.
Yeah.
That being said, there is still some manufacturing happening. Let's talk about some of the strengths and what are some of those requirements to get into
the
production
strengths at
here?
base are that you're employing Americans. It's close to home. You've got no customs clearance, and you have no long lead times on product. I think that, and that works for a number of programs. So government programs that are Berry compliant, those have to be produced in U.S.
Berry compliant.
Berry compliant is really driven from the U.S. Department of Defense to protect suppliers during times of war, so that they're always trying to keep an industry alive should you not be able to get things from outside. So a lot of military uniforms are need to be Berry compliant. That means made in the U.S. or a U.S. protectorate. So Puerto Rico is a main manufacturer also of Berry compliant items.
Sure. Okay.
So, the challenges you have in the U.S. generally are that it's expensive, of course,
Right.
super expensive. So a lot of people, we've had a number of conversations with people like, hey, we want made in the USA. And I'm like, well, you want a $200 polo, versus $25 overseas. And those conversations kind of shift pretty quickly. There's a lot of opportunities for new and burgeoning companies to produce in the U.S. also, because they can buy much smaller quantities in the U.S. They can use these kind of operations that are on the coasts, majority of them on the coast, some of them are in middle America. But they can run these programs, they can test the success of their particular brand or style or whatever, and they get back into it and kind of build that business. That's great for revenue, that's great for kind of driving the test, if you will. But when it comes down to profitability, it can always be challenged, because you're always kind of pressing profits to kind of fall in line with a reasonable MSRP.
Sure.
A manufacturer's suggested retail price. And so that tends to be challenging. Super complex programs in the U.S. become even more expensive, because you're applying that labor rate times the complexity of the program, which means that they're spending more hours on it.
Sure. That being said, you can kind of get into some of these places with a much lower MOQ.
Yeah, you can. And there is this incredible conversation going on with robotics. Robotics taking the place of workers in the U.S. and major tasking and speeding up process, and whole garment knitting and 3D garment knitting, and adjusting assembly lines for different parts that can be robotically sewed or put together. Those kind of things will level the playing field, and more opportunities can come to the U.S. when you're applying this new technology that's starting to make its way into our business. For a lot of years, human labor was always so much less expensive, so no one invested in technology. But for places where even the least expensive labor exists, like Bangladesh, you're seeing robotics playing parts in the line, speeding up different processes. So it's definitely bound to come home to roost in the U.S. And I think there will be a new economy in apparel, perhaps, in the U.S. with robotics.
That would be so exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really enlightening. And if you would like to get a little bit of a deeper dive yourself, we do have a download available. It's called Production, Understanding Origins for Production Minimums. And we will make sure to have this on our website at starsdesigngroup.com and access the show notes everywhere. You'll be able to find it. So thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to reach out and let us know if you have any questions. And most importantly, subscribe to stay apprised of upcoming episodes of Clothing Culture.